The old man walked into the courtroom with his head held high. His weathered hands gripped a walking stick, and on his chest hung a medal that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The Victoria Cross gleamed against his dark jacket, its bronze surface polished to perfection. Everyone in the room noticed it immediately. James Morrison had worn that medal for 37 years. He wore it to remembrance ceremonies, veterans gatherings, and special occasions. People would shake his hand and thank him for his service. Children would stare in wonder at the famous medal, knowing it meant their grandfather was a war hero. The Victoria Cross was Britain's highest military honor, given only to those who showed extraordinary courage in the face of the enemy. Today, James was in court for a minor traffic violation. Nothing serious, just a speeding ticket he wanted to contest. He had been driving to visit his sick wife in the hospital and claimed the circumstances were urgent. The courtroom was nearly empty except for a few other people waiting for their cases to be called. Judge Patricia Williams looked up from her papers as James approached the defendant's table. Her eyes immediately fell on the Victoria Cross. She had seen many veterans in her courtroom over the years, but she had never seen anyone wearing this particular medal. Something stirred in her memory, a nagging feeling she couldn't quite place. "Mr. Morrison," she said, adjusting her glasses, "I see you're wearing the Victoria Cross. That's quite an honor." James straightened his shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor. Earned it in Korea, 1951. Saved my entire platoon from an enemy ambush." His voice carried the confidence of someone who had told this story many times before. The judge nodded respectfully, but that feeling in her gut grew stronger. Her father had been a military historian, and she had grown up surrounded by books about wars and medals. Something about James Morrison didn't add up, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. As the morning progressed, Judge Williams found herself distracted by the medal gleaming on James's chest. During a brief recess, she made an unusual decision. Instead of simply processing his traffic case, she asked her clerk to do a quick search on Victoria Cross recipients from the Korean War. What she found made her blood run cold. James Morrison was not on the list. In fact, according to the official records, no Victoria Cross had been awarded to any British soldier named James Morrison during the Korean conflict. The judge stared at her computer screen, reading and rereading the information. She had always prided herself on being thorough, but this discovery went beyond her usual attention to detail. When court resumed, Judge Williams looked at James with new eyes. He sat calmly in his chair, occasionally touching the medal as if to reassure himself it was still there. Other people in the courtroom continued to glance at him with respect and admiration. A young lawyer even approached during another break to thank him for his service. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said when his case was finally called, "before we discuss your traffic violation, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your military service." James seemed surprised but nodded. "Of course, Your Honor, I'm always happy to talk about my time in the service. You mentioned earning the Victoria Cross in Korea in 1951. Can you tell me more about the specific action that earned you this honor?" James launched into a detailed story about a night ambush, enemy fire, and his brave rescue of wounded soldiers. He spoke with conviction, gesturing with his hands and looking directly at the judge. To anyone listening, it sounded like the account of a genuine war hero, but Judge Williams noticed small inconsistencies in his story. Details that didn't match what she knew about military procedures and historical facts from that period. Her father's lessons about military history were coming back to her, and James's account had several elements that didn't ring true. The judge made another unprecedented decision. She called for a longer recess and asked her clerk to contact the Ministry of Defense to verify James Morrison's military records. While they waited, James sat in the courtroom, still touching his medal and chatting with other defendants about his wartime experiences. 30 minutes later, the clerk returned with information that confirmed the judge's worst suspicions. James Morrison had indeed served in the military, but he had never been deployed to Korea. He had spent his entire service period stationed in England, working in a supply depot. He had never seen combat, never saved a platoon, and certainly never earned the Victoria Cross. Judge Williams felt a mix of anger and sadness as she prepared to confront James with the truth. This was not just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about honor, integrity, and the respect owed to real war heroes. She thought about all the genuine Victoria Cross recipients who had earned their medals through actual acts of extraordinary bravery, and how this man's deception diminished their sacrifices. As she called James back to approach the bench, she noticed how proudly he still wore the medal. For 37 years he had built his identity around a lie. She wondered how many people he had deceived, how many stories he had told, and how many times he had accepted thanks and praise that belonged to someone else. The confrontation that was about to unfold would change everything for James Morrison, and it would become a story that people in the courthouse would talk about for years to come. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Williams said, her voice steady but firm, "I have some concerns about your military record that I need to address." James looked puzzled. "Concerns, Your Honor? I don't understand." The judge held up the papers her clerk had brought her. "According to the official records from the Ministry of Defense, you served in the British Army from 1949 to 1953. However, you were never deployed to Korea. You spent your entire service period at a supply depot in Manchester." The color drained from James's face. His hand instinctively moved to touch the Victoria Cross as if drawing strength from it. "There must be some mistake, Your Honor. I was definitely in Korea. I remember it clearly." "Mr. Morrison, these are official military records. They show no deployment to Korea, and no Victoria Cross awarded to anyone with your name and service number." The judge's voice remained calm, but everyone in the courtroom could sense the gravity of the situation. James began to stammer. "The records must be wrong. Sometimes paperwork gets lost or misfiled. You know how it is with government bureaucracy." He forced a nervous laugh, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. Judge Williams had prosecuted enough cases to recognize the signs of someone whose lies were catching up with them. But she also saw something else in James's eyes, genuine confusion as if he truly believed his own story. "Mr. Morrison, where did you obtain this Victoria Cross?" she asked, pointing to the medal on his chest. "It was issued to me after the action in Korea," James replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "I've had it for 37 years. The judge made a decision that would later be debated in legal circles. Instead of simply holding James in contempt of court, she wanted to understand how a man could live such an elaborate lie for so many years. She asked the court clerk to contact a local military museum to have an expert examine the medal. While they waited, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. Other defendants and lawyers who had been chatting with James earlier now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. The young lawyer who had thanked him for his service sat in shocked silence. James seemed to shrink into himself. The confident war hero persona that had defined him for decades was crumbling before everyone's eyes. He kept touching the medal, but now it seemed more like a nervous habit than a gesture of pride. 20 minutes later, Colonel retired David Thompson arrived from the Imperial War Museum. He was an expert on military medals and decorations, and Judge Williams asked him to examine James's Victoria Cross. Colonel Thompson approached James with professional courtesy, but careful scrutiny. "May I examine your medal, sir?" he asked. With trembling hands, James unpinned the Victoria Cross from his jacket and handed it over. Colonel Thompson pulled out a small magnifying glass and began his examination. The entire courtroom watched in silence as he studied the medal from every angle. After several minutes, Colonel Thompson looked up with a grim expression. "Your Honor, this is indeed a Victoria Cross, but it's not an original wartime issue. The bronze composition is wrong, and the craftsmanship shows characteristics of reproductions made in the 1970s or later. Additionally, the ribbon is not authentic. It's made from synthetic material that wasn't used during the Korean War period." The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. James Morrison had not only fabricated his war record, but he had also been wearing a fake medal for over 3 decades. Furthermore, Colonel Thompson continued, even if this were a real Victoria Cross, it wouldn't belong to Mr. Morrison. Each medal is engraved with the recipient's name and service details on the reverse. This one has no engravings at all. James slumped in his chair, the weight of his deception finally crushing down on him. The medal that had given him identity, respect, and purpose for 37 years was revealed to be nothing more than a cheap replica. Judge Williams looked at the broken man before her. "Mr. Morrison, do you understand the seriousness of what has happened here today? You have not only deceived this court, but you have dishonored every genuine veteran who earned their medals through actual sacrifice and bravery." "I never meant to hurt anyone," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "It just started so small and then it became my whole life." The judge realized she was witnessing something more complex than simple fraud. This was a man who had lived a fantasy for so long that it had become his reality. She wondered what had driven him to create such an elaborate deception, and how many people's lives had been affected by his lies. As word of the confrontation began to spread through the courthouse, Judge Williams knew she faced a difficult decision. How do you punish a man whose entire identity has just been destroyed? And how do you repair the damage done to the honor of real war heroes? The case that had started as a simple traffic violation was now becoming one of the most memorable and complex situations Judge Williams had ever encountered in her courtroom. Judge Williams called for a 30-minute recess to process what had just unfolded. As the courtroom emptied, James remained in his seat, staring at the fake medal now lying on the defendant's table. Colonel Thompson had left it there like evidence of a crime, which in many ways it was. During the break, word spread quickly through the courthouse corridors. Court clerks, lawyers, and security guards huddled in small groups discussing the dramatic revelation. Many of them had seen James in the courthouse before, always wearing his medal with pride, always ready to share stories of his heroic service in Korea. Sarah Mitchell, a court reporter who had worked in the building for 15 years, remembered several encounters with James. He would come here for various minor issues over the years, she told her colleagues. Traffic tickets, small civil matters. He always wore that medal, and people would always thank him. I even introduced him to my nephew once, told the boy he was meeting a real war hero. The revelation was particularly painful for the veterans in the courthouse that day. Tom Bradley, a retired sergeant who had actually served in Korea, felt personally betrayed. "I lost good friends in that war," he said to anyone who would listen. "Men who died for real, not in some made-up story. This guy has been stealing their honor for 40 years. Meanwhile, Judge Williams was in her chambers trying to understand how to handle the situation. She had called the district attorney's office to discuss potential charges. Wearing military medals you didn't earn was illegal in many jurisdictions, and fraud was certainly a consideration. But she also recognized that James Morrison was not a typical criminal. Her clerk brought her more information that had been uncovered during the extended investigation. James Morrison was 74 years old, had been married to the same woman for 52 years and had 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local school district for 35 years before retiring. By all accounts, except for this massive deception, he had lived a quiet, law-abiding life. More troubling was the discovery that James had been invited to speak at schools during Veterans Day ceremonies. He had told his fabricated war stories to hundreds of children over the years, teaching them about courage and sacrifice while living a lie. Local newspapers had even published articles about him, referring to him as one of our community's last living heroes from the Korean War. When court resumed, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. James looked smaller somehow, as if the exposure of his lie had physically diminished him. Judge Williams noticed that he kept glancing at the fake medal on the table, but he no longer reached for it. "Mr. Morrison," the judge began, "I need to understand how this deception began. This court needs to know the truth, not just for legal purposes, but because your actions have affected many people in this community." James was quiet for a long moment, struggling to find words. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky but honest in a way it hadn't been all morning. "It started in 1968, Your Honor. I was at a job interview and the interviewer noticed I was a veteran. He asked if I had seen combat and I lied. I said I had been in Korea." He paused, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The man's brother had died in Korea, and when I said I had served there, he got emotional. He thanked me and said it meant a lot to him to meet someone who had been there. I got the job, and I told myself it was just a small lie that made someone feel better. Judge Williams listened intently as James continued his confession. "A few years later, I bought the fake medal at a military surplus store. I told myself it was just a replica, something to make my story more believable. I never planned for it to go on so long." The judge could see genuine remorse in James's eyes, but she also understood the magnitude of his deception. "Mr. Morrison, you've been living this lie for over 50 years. You've accepted honor and recognition that belonged to men who actually fought and died in Korea. Do you understand how serious this is? Yes, ma'am, James replied, his voice breaking. I understand now. But at the time, it just kept growing. People would invite me to speak at events. Veterans would shake my hand and share their own war stories with me. Children would look at me like I was a hero. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop without admitting I had been lying all along. The courtroom was completely silent as James continued. My own family believed the story. My children grew up proud of their father's war service. My grandchildren would brag about their hero grandfather at school. How could I tell them it was all a lie? Judge Williams realized she was dealing with a man who had become trapped by his own fabrication. The lie had grown so large and lasted so long that telling the truth would have meant destroying not just his own reputation, but hurting everyone who had believed in him. Colonel Thompson, who had remained in the courtroom, spoke up. Your Honor, if I may, this situation illustrates a serious problem we see occasionally in the veteran community. There are people who wear medals they didn't earn, claim service they never performed, and steal valor that belongs to others. It dishonors every person who actually served with distinction. The judge nodded, understanding the colonel's point. But she also saw a broken old man who had lived with a terrible secret for most of his adult life. The question now was how to balance justice with compassion, and how to repair the damage done to the memory of real war heroes. As the afternoon wore on, more details about James Morrison's deception came to light. Judge Williams had asked her staff to contact various organizations where James had been involved, and the scope of his fabricated heroism was staggering. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post confirmed that James had been a member for over 20 years. He had served on committees, participated in Memorial Day parades, and was considered one of their most respected members. The post commander, Robert Hayes, arrived at the courthouse when he heard about the situation. This is devastating, Hayes told Judge Williams during a brief sidebar. James has been like a father figure to many of our younger veterans. He's counseled men coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, telling them about his own struggles with what we now call PTSD from his time in Korea. These men trusted him, opened up to him about their own trauma. The judge felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. This wasn't just about one man's lie anymore. It was about the trust and healing that had been built on false foundations. Real veterans had shared their deepest struggles with someone they thought understood their pain, only to discover that understanding was based on fabricated experiences. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a psychiatrist who worked with veterans, had been contacted by the court to provide insight into James's psychological state. She arrived in the late afternoon and spent an hour interviewing James in a private room adjacent to the courtroom. When she emerged, Dr. Reeves spoke privately with Judge Williams. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison appears to be suffering from what psychologists call pseudologia fantastica, a condition where someone tells elaborate lies that they eventually begin to believe themselves. It often starts with a desire for acceptance or respect, but over time, the fabricated identity becomes so central to the person's self-concept that they lose track of what's real. Are you saying he actually believes he was in Korea? The judge asked. It's complicated, Dr. Reeves explained. Part of him knows the truth, but another part has lived the fabricated story for so long that it feels real to him. When you confronted him with the evidence, you saw his confusion. That was genuine. He's been living in a psychological prison of his own making for decades. Meanwhile, news of the courtroom drama had begun to spread beyond the courthouse. A local news reporter had been in the building covering another case and overheard the commotion. By evening, the story was making headlines. Local war hero exposed as fraud in traffic court. James's family was contacted by the media before they heard the news from James himself. His daughter, Patricia Morrison Chen, rushed to the courthouse with her teenage son. She had grown up believing her father was a decorated war veteran. Her son had written school reports about his grandfather's heroic service in Korea. I don't understand, Patricia said to Judge Williams, tears streaming down her face. My father has told us these stories our whole lives. He has photo albums, newspaper clippings. How could it all be fake? The judge realized that James's deception had created a complex web of false memories and fabricated evidence. Over the years, he had collected Korean War memorabilia, studied the conflict extensively, and created a detailed backstory that could withstand casual scrutiny. He had become an expert on a war he had never fought, in order to support a lie he couldn't escape. As evening approached, Judge Williams faced an unprecedented decision. The original traffic case seemed trivial now compared to the larger issues of fraud, stolen valor, and the psychological damage to multiple communities. She could charge James with fraud and send him to prison, but what would that accomplish? He was 74 years old, had no criminal record apart from this elaborate deception, and was clearly suffering from the exposure of his lifelong lie. Colonel Thompson approached the judge with another perspective. Your Honor, I've been thinking about this situation all day. While Mr. Morrison's actions are inexcusable, I believe there might be a way to handle this that serves justice while also providing some healing for the veteran community he has wronged. What do you suggest? Judge Williams asked. Instead of just punishment, what if we required Mr. Morrison to face the veterans he has deceived? Let him tell his real story. Not the fabricated heroism, but the truth about why he felt the need to lie. It might help other people who are struggling with similar issues of self-worth and identity. The judge considered this unusual approach. Traditional justice would involve fines, possibly jail time, and a criminal record. But this situation called for something different, a form of restorative justice that might heal the wounds James had created while also addressing the underlying psychological issues that had led to his deception. As the courthouse prepared to close for the day, James sat alone in the courtroom looking lost and broken. The fake medal still lay on the table in front of him, no longer a source of pride but a symbol of a life built on lies. For the first time in 50 years, he was facing the world without his fabricated identity, and he had no idea who he really was anymore. Judge Williams knew that whatever sentence she imposed would have to account for the complex human tragedy that had unfolded in her courtroom. This was no ordinary case of fraud. It was a story about identity, belonging, and the desperate human need for respect and recognition. The next morning, Judge Williams reconvened court with an unusual proposal. She had spent the entire night researching similar cases and consulting with legal experts, veteran advocates, and mental health professionals. What she was about to suggest had never been tried before in her jurisdiction. Mr. Morrison, she began, after careful consideration of all the facts, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to traditional criminal charges. However, this alternative will require courage from you. I do the real kind, not the fabricated heroism you've claimed for so many years. James looked up with hollow eyes. He had aged years in just one day. His family sat behind him, still struggling to process the revelation that their patriarch's defining characteristic had been a lie. I'm prepared to place you on probation instead of sending you to prison. But with very specific conditions, Judge Williams continued. First, you will surrender that fake medal to the court, and it will be donated to the Imperial War Museum as an example of fraudulent military decorations. Second, you will pay a fine equivalent to any benefits or recognition you received based on your false claims. James nodded weakly, but the judge wasn't finished. Third, and most importantly, you will spend the next 2 years telling your real story. You will visit the schools where you previously spoke as a fake war hero, and you will explain to those students what really happened. You will attend veteran support groups and share your true experience, not as someone who fought in Korea, but as someone who was so desperate for respect and belonging that he stole the valor of genuine heroes. The courtroom was silent as the weight of this unusual sentence sank in. Judge Williams was asking James to do something, potentially more difficult than serving jail time, to voluntarily destroy his reputation in every community where he had built it on lies. Colonel Thompson spoke up from the gallery. Your Honor, I think this approach has merit. The veteran community needs to understand how and why this deception happened. It might help us identify and help others who are struggling with similar issues. Dr. Reeves also supported the unusual sentence. Public confession in service can be therapeutic, she explained to the court. Mr. Morrison has been carrying the psychological burden of this lie for 50 years. The process of telling the truth, as painful as it will be, might finally free him from that burden. But not everyone agreed with the judge's approach. Several real Korean War veterans who had gathered in the courtroom expressed anger and frustration. Harold Peterson, who had lost his best friend in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, stood up to address the court. Your Honor, with all due respect, this man has stolen our honor for 50 years. He's taken credit for sacrifices he never made, and accepted gratitude that belonged to better men than him. He should go to prison, not get a chance to rehabilitate his image with more talking. Judge Williams understood Peterson's anger, but she held firm in her belief that this approach could serve a greater purpose. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate your service and I understand your anger. But sending Mr. Morrison to prison won't undo the damage he's done, or help prevent others from making similar choices. This sentence requires him to face every person he's deceived and admit his fraud publicly. It requires him to help the veteran community understand how this happened, so it can be prevented in the future." James himself seemed overwhelmed by the proposal. "Your Honor, I'm not sure I can do what you're asking. The shame, my family, everyone will know." "Mr. Morrison," the judge replied firmly, "everyone will know anyway. The news media is already covering this story. You can either face the consequences of your actions with dignity, by helping others learn from your mistakes, or you can hide in prison while your lies continue to damage the veteran community you pretended to serve." After a long pause, James looked up at Judge Williams. "If I agree to this sentence, will it help make up for what I've done?" "It won't undo 50 years of deception," the judge answered honestly. "But it might help prevent others from following the same path, and it might help heal some of the wounds you've created in the veteran community." Patricia, James's daughter, asked to speak to the court. "Your Honor, our family is devastated by what we've learned. But we also love our father, even though we're struggling to understand who he really is underneath all these lies. If this sentence can help him find his real identity and help other people at the same time, we support it." The Veterans of Foreign Wars Post Commander Robert Hayes also addressed the court. "Judge Williams, if Mr. Morrison follows through with this sentence honestly, if he really tells the truth about why he did this and helps us understand how to prevent it from happening again, then I believe our veteran community can eventually forgive him. But he has to earn that forgiveness through real service, not more stories." As the day progressed, James made his decision. With his voice barely above a whisper, he accepted the judge's alternative sentence. He would spend the next 2 years traveling to every place where he had claimed to be a war hero, telling the truth about his deception and the psychological factors that had led to it. Judge Williams made it clear that this was not an easy way out. "Mr. Morrison, if you violate any terms of this probation, if you fail to appear at any scheduled appearance, or if you tell anything other than the complete truth during your presentations, you will immediately be sentenced to the maximum prison term for fraud." As James left the courtroom that day, he carried a burden different from the one he had borne for 50 years. Instead of the weight of maintaining a lie, he now carried the responsibility of making amends for it. The fake medal was gone, but the real work of rebuilding his identity was just beginning. 2 years later, James Morrison returned to Judge Williams's courtroom for his final probation hearing. The man who walked through those doors was different from the one who had been exposed as a fraud. He moved with less pride, but more authenticity, carrying himself like someone who had learned to live with uncomfortable truths. The transformation had not been easy. James's first public confession had been at Roosevelt Elementary School, where he had spoken to children about his heroic service in Korea just 6 months before his exposure. Facing those young faces and admitting he had lied to them was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. "I told those kids that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes," James recounted to Judge Williams. "I explained that I had wanted to be important so badly that I stole stories that belonged to real heroes." Some of them cried. Some were angry, but one little boy asked me why I didn't think my real story was important enough. That child's question had haunted James throughout his 2 years of public confession. Why hadn't he thought his real life was worth respecting? Why had he believed that only war heroism could make him valuable as a person? Dr. Reeves, who had continued to work with James throughout his probation, reported to the court that he had made remarkable psychological progress. "Mr. Morrison has confronted the shame and inadequacy that drove his original deception," she explained. "The process of public confession has been therapeutic but also incredibly difficult. He's had to rebuild his entire sense of identity." The statistics from James's 2 years of truth-telling were impressive. He had spoken at 43 schools, 15 veteran organizations, 12 community groups, and 8 military bases. He had appeared on local television programs and participated in 3 documentary films about stolen valor. Most remarkably, his honesty had inspired 17 other people to come forward and admit their own false military claims. Colonel Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally in James's rehabilitation, testified about the positive impact of his confessions, Your Honor, Mr. Morrison's presentations have helped our military community understand the psychology behind stolen valor. He's helped us identify warning signs and develop better ways to support veterans who might be struggling with feelings of inadequacy. But the most powerful testimony came from Harold Peterson, the Korean War veteran who had initially called for James to be imprisoned. Peterson had attended one of James's presentations at a VFW post and had been moved by the genuine remorse and insight he witnessed. "Judge Williams," Peterson said, "I went to that meeting ready to hate James Morrison all over again, but what I saw was a broken man who was trying to rebuild himself by helping others. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He just told the truth about his weakness and shame, and somehow that took more courage than I initially gave him credit for." Peterson paused, struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "My buddy who died in Korea, he would have wanted this man to find redemption through service rather than rot in a prison cell. James has done more to honor real veterans in these past 2 years than his 50 years of lies ever did to dishonor them." James's family had also been on a journey of discovery and healing. His daughter Patricia addressed the court with tears in her eyes. "Your Honor, these 2 years have been incredibly difficult for our family. We had to grieve the father and grandfather we thought we knew, and learn to love the imperfect man he really is. But in many ways, the real James Morrison is more admirable than the fake war hero ever was. The courage it took to face his shame publicly, to help other people learn from his mistakes, that's real heroism." The judge also heard from some of James's critics. Not everyone had been moved by his public confessions. Some veterans still considered his sentence too lenient, and some community members felt betrayed beyond redemption. Judge Williams acknowledged these perspectives while explaining her reasoning for the unusual approach. "This court recognizes that Mr. Morrison's actions caused real harm to real people," she said. "No sentence could undo 50 years of deception or fully compensate for the trust that was broken. However, the goal of justice should include rehabilitation and prevention, not just punishment." As James stood for his final sentencing, Judge Williams reflected on the unprecedented case that had challenged her understanding of justice, redemption, and human nature. "Mr. Morrison, you have completed your probation requirements faithfully and honestly. You have faced the consequences of your actions with courage and dignity. Your service to the veteran community over the past 2 years, while it cannot erase your past deception, has demonstrated genuine remorse and a commitment to making amends." The judge officially closed James's case, but she also issued a warning to anyone who might be tempted to follow his path. "Let this case serve as a reminder that stolen valor dishonors not only real veterans, but also diminishes the person who chooses deception over authenticity. Mr. Morrison's story shows us that the truth, no matter how ordinary it might seem, is always more valuable than the most elaborate lie." As James left the courtroom for the final time, he was no longer wearing any medals, but he carried something more valuable: the respect he had earned through genuine service and the peace that comes from living authentically. His transformation from a decorated fraud to a humble truth-teller had become an unexpected lesson about the real meaning of courage and honor. The case of James Morrison would be studied in law schools, referenced in veteran support programs, and remembered in the courthouse as the day a traffic ticket led to one of the most unusual and ultimately redemptive sentences in the court's history.